And anyway, this one came up for sale at the beginning of last year, and I was like, I must have this. So I bought that. So that's my favorite thing. In fact, you might be able to, on the table there, you can see the helmet. Actually, let me. So the helmet here, the sort of bubble helmet, and then this is the. This is a perfect replica of the Apollo Snoopy helmet as well. Even the fabric is exact. It's the exact fabric, and it's really a very, very close thing. I've also got some moon dust for you. That is Jane Gordon's here. Hi Jane. Look, you're just in time to see some moon dust. It's not, again, a bit like my spacesuit.
Don't sneeze.
Don't sneeze. A bit like my spacesuit. This is sort of analog moon dust. I actually got this from the European Space Agency. And it's made on Earth, but it's mechanically exact moon dust, which scientists can use to study, and also they can use this to practice doing things like 3D printing, so things like designing habitats. Hi Jane, habitats on the moon and stuff. So that's rather fun. I've got that. What else? I've got a whole bunch of stuff here. I've got a Heston Blumenthal bacon sandwich that was made for Tim Peake. That was Tim Peake's snack, and you can see it's in bacon sarnie, and it's also in Russian because everything's in both English and Russian on the ISS. And there's the ESA logo, and I think if you look, I can't really see. You might be able to see Heston Blumenthal's name.
I reckon you could probably.
I think we've got Ed Booth in the room. Ed, who's my producer. Didn't you? I think you did. Didn't you make a program about Heston Blumenthal making these sandwiches?
No, I think that was Kate.
Oh, okay.
Kate Dooley. Yeah. I know she did a lot of work with him. I don't think I did. I did do one years ago about the Americans have got the American military have a warehouse full of sandwiches that last 3 years.
There you go.
So basically, if they suddenly go out to war or fancy a picnic, they just go and raid this warehouse, open up these sandwiches, and they're all, well, supposedly fresh, edible.
There you go. One of the Apollo,
Subway.
There was an Apollo bacon sandwich that came up for sale. Anyway, that's Ed. That's Ed, who was Ed is a TV producer, and Ed was the producer on Bang Goes the Theory, which was a science series we did on BBC One. That's Ed in the house.
Hi, Ed.
One of the
Hello.
great science producers of all time.
Do you get dressed in your spacesuit and walk around the house very much?
When I first got this, I was so excited because I'm like, yes, finally. Because when I was a kid, I remember going around, I think it was Chatsworth House, I think it was, in sort of Cheshire or somewhere with Staffordshire around there. And I remember in this big stately home being dragged around by my mother, and I was really, really bored. And I remember at the foot of this great grand staircase, there was a kind of a suit of armor with a spear, and I thought that was quite good. And I remember thinking, actually, what would be much better in this house is if they had a space suit at the foot of the stairs, because that would be really, really good. And so I've always thought in that kind of Mr. Ben way, if you remember Mr. Ben, the cartoon, it would be really, really cool to have a spacesuit in my house, and now I have one. Even though it's not a real one. I did have some real ones as well. I had some of the Russian Sokol suits for a while knocking around, but unfortunately I had to give them back. I had them for about 10 years. The guy who owned them forgot I had them, and and then I got this phone call. It was like, I need my spacesuits back. I was like, oh no.
They need them for a mission.
No, they needed them because they're worth lots and lots of money. And I shouldn't have them. It's the reason they should have. Anyway, so there you go. Hi Sue.
Dallas, I've been listening to your book on Audible because I did order a hard copy. Like you say, I'm not getting to appreciate the pictures and stuff.
Yeah.
So I did order the hard copy, but what with there being a pandemic, it's not going to arrive till about the 2nd of May.
I don't think you can get the hard copy. It's sold out. I mean, I wrote that a few years ago.
Something. Maybe we've got like a bootleg copy of your book.
Okay, but I know because we did a hardback. We did like a hardback run of, I can't remember how many, and they're all gone now. So you can only really get it on Kindle or secondhand bookshops or.
Well, I've got something coming in the post anyway. Good. So I look forward to that. But I have been listening to your book on Audible, and your book. Tell us a little bit about your book and about the research that you did for it, because it's all about getting off planet.
Yeah, well, this is the book, and I wrote it about 3 years ago, 2017, I think it came out, and it's yeah, well, it really came about because I'm a member of the British Interplanetary Society. If you've ever been to the
Represent
British,
Earth.
well, basically, it's the oldest kind of space organization ever on in the world. It's been going since the early 1930s, long before we ever went into space. And they have the most fantastic library in the British Interplanetary Society. You should go there. It's just behind Vauxhall Station, and it's a really unassuming building. But they've got the most amazing library. And always had a big collection of space books, of kind of really weird space books. I was just talking about this one. This is about the kind of a woman who designed the interiors of the Soyuz spacecraft. I've always really loved that. My Ladybird Exploring Space book, which I've had for a long time. And it's, I love this book because it's been sort of signed by astronauts, and, I've got all this I had this sort of collection of kind of really kind of fun, cool space books. And I just thought, actually, what I need to do is somehow collect all these books, these thousands, but all different arcane subjects, and put them into kind of one user-friendly volume, which is kind of what I did. And also there was in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there was this really lovely bit that Douglas Adams wrote about a kind of user's guide to leaving the planet. It was a sort of 5-point plan, like point 1, call NASA. And it was just, point 2, call the Kremlin. And then point 5 was...
that last night.
Yeah, and then point 5 was like, well, if all that fails and you still haven't left the planet, then you can try and hitchhike from a passing flying saucer. So I like that idea of doing it as a kind of Douglas Adams-y guidebook with everything you might need to know. So it's got everything from, it's got all the practical stuff. If you need to leave the planet, how you would go about doing it, which rocket, how spacesuits. But it's a history book, really. It's a book about history, about and anthropology, I suppose, cultural anthropology, why we want to go into space in the first place and how we did it. But I start early, I start in, 2nd century AD through to the Jacobeans and all the way through. So it's not just about modern space, it's about our dreams of going to space as long as we've been looking up in the sky, I suppose. But I liked it. I had a lot of fun writing it. And it was painful having to cut it back because it could have been obviously 10 times the length of this.
One of my favourite little bits I was telling you about earlier was the quote from Kepler about people who are suitable for space travel.
Oh yeah, well, it's really, again, it's like when we think about leaving the planet, we think about astronauts. And when we think about astronauts, we always imagine ourselves in that position. Could we go into space? What does it take to have the right stuff? This term, the right stuff, that of course we all know from the Tom Wolfe book. What does the right stuff mean? And of course now you can just sort of go online and you can download the NASA application form. But actually I sort of dug into the kind of archives, and I found this book by Johannes Kepler, the scientist, of course, who we owe so much in terms of things like orbits and that kind of thing. And he wrote a book called Somnium, which means dream. And like a lot of these scientists, they're also great fantasists. They had all these amazing ideas, would write all this kind of proto-science fiction. And there was this wonderful description of the types of people that Johannes Kepler thought would be best to go into space. I've got it right here, so I'll get it up for you. So this is it, Johannes Kepler. So this is 16 something. So this is the title of the book here, Somnium. And this is what he said. He said, in terms of people going to space, we do not admit desk-bound humans into these ranks, nor the fat, nor the foppish. But we choose those who regularly spend their time hunting with swift horses, or those who voyage in ships to the Indies and are accustomed to living on hard bread, garlic, dried fish, and other abhorrent foods. The best adapted for the journey are dried-out old women, since from youth they're accustomed to riding goats at night, or pitchforks, or travelling the wide expanses of the earth in worn-out clothes. There are none in Germany who are suitable, but the dry bodies of Spaniards are not rejected. See, I think that's pretty good. So there you go. Johannes Kepler, everyone.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So he knew what he was talking about. But I love all that kind of stuff. I love, the other great sort of proto-science fiction was Bishop Francis Godwin's The Man in the Moon. So this was 1638, I think it was. And it describes a sort of fantastic voyage to the moon, whereby the method of propulsion was being pulled up by geese, these special geese that Francis Godwin imagined, called Ganza. And within this kind of journey to the moon, he has this extraordinary adventure, but there's all these descriptions of the science of the day, of sort of gravity and electromagnetism. And so it's all mixed up in the sort of culture and the art and the literature, all mixed up in the science. And that for me is really the thing that interests me. I've just got this picture of Ed now. All I can just see is Ed sitting there. How come I've got that? Well, that's better.
I don't know. It's a fantasy, Dallas.
Is that what it is? It's like when I was thinking of...
I've been in your head for years. I know. It's embarrassing, but hey. What I want to know, actually, it's a bit off subject. Do you still have little Dallas that went to space?
Oh, shit!
Well, went to the edge of space.
Don't move. Hold on, everyone. Right here. So maybe Ed can tell the story.
Well, when we were doing Bango's a Theory years ago, I don't know whose idea it was, but we came up with the idea of using a weather balloon, which can go up to about 110,000 feet, which isn't space, but hey, it's a long way up.
The edge of space.
The edge of space, exactly.
But
what was fun about it, so we got Dallas, 3D printed, and spent up little Dallas. So that has been to, 100, it was 110, 112,000 feet, and the balloon pops.
We did it because we were celebrating, it was the anniversary. There was a sort of proto-astronaut, a guy called Joe Kittinger in America.
That's right.
Before the space program really took off, so this is the late 1950s, the American Air Force would send up these high altitude balloons in order to study the stratosphere, the high atmosphere. And there was a guy called Joe Kittinger who went up in one of these balloons, and he was also testing out the latest spacesuits, this idea of the pressure suit, can the human body survive that high? Not only did he go to the very edge of the atmosphere, 110,000, oh God, I used to know the exact figure, I can't remember now. But he then jumped out, and for the longest time, it was the world's highest parachute jump, and he broke the sound barrier and what have you. Anyway, so we redid that. But this actually ended up, I don't know if you remember, this parachuted back to Earth, and it ended up in a Travis Perkins timber yard somewhere in Norfolk. That is a bit of television history. Right there. Oh shit, I just dropped it.
It was a piece of television history.
But I quite like, but there you go, look, I've got two, almost the same suit. I've obviously been thinking about this for far too long.
We were talking earlier about... Oh, sorry. Ed,
I'm just saying I'm glad to know he still exists. I've been very fond of
he's in pride of place.
Excellent.
We were talking earlier about the kind of parallels between early seafaring expeditions and forays into space. And also in your book, you talk about people exploring Antarctica and places like that, and I collect expedition accounts, and I love those like Shackleton Adventures and those adventures to really desperately bleak places that adventurers of old would go wearing like woolly socks and a few extra jackets. So the beginnings of space travel, what were people wearing in space, and did they come a cropper?
Oh gosh, well, you're right about those. You're right about the parallels between Antarctica and space travel are right there. In fact, the Russian-Soviet push into Antarctica in the 1950s, the Vostok base, in fact, if you go there, I think it's the pole of inaccessibility, it's called. It's the most remote place on Earth, the furthest it's away from any, civilization. And if you go there, there is still a bust of Lenin in the middle of Antarctica, in the middle of nowhere, that's left over from that. But of course, Vostok, that became the name of the spacecraft as well. And so the Soviets went straight from Antarctica, and then off into space. And that same sense of adventure, that same pushing back of frontiers, that same exposure to hardship was very much, was very much there, because it was all about trying to get the technological and the exploration higher ground. That was kind of the beginnings of the space race. And even now, Antarctica still features heavily in space travel. A lot of space medicine, for example, they do a lot of analog missions in Antarctica. I have a friend called Beth Healy who wintered over in Antarctica, basically as a space analog. You go there in the winter where it's completely black. You're completely isolated from the rest of the world. You can't get out. And so they study human behavior there as a space analog. So yeah, these parallels are similar, and you see it throughout space history, these sort of parallels. In terms of clothes, yeah, I mean, the kind of history of the spacesuit owes a lot to the history of the clothes that we wore when we were exploring polar regions. The spacesuit has to keep you warm. It has to keep, it has to keep you safe. So there's all kinds of parallels there. I'm going to do a whole lecture on the history of the spacesuit, I think.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, sometime.
Right. September.
Yeah.
First Wednesday in September.
Yeah, but that idea of hardship as well, those Shackleton expeditions.
I mean, the escape from Antarctica is like the most amazing diary, I think, of those kinds of adventures. And I was listening to it where Beth talks in your book, and she was talking about, it being night, it's being dark for so long, and seeing the aurora all day long, but not being able to distinguish between night and day.
Yeah.
And, I wonder the sort of effect that would have on somebody long term, because, Shackleton just about made it, but it seemed like it was very, very taxing for everybody there, and obviously the ultimate endurance.
Well, that's the hardest thing, I think. When you think about being an astronaut, I mean, the Apollo astronauts didn't really have that problem, because going to the moon only takes a couple of days, and then maybe you have a day on the moon. Well, the whole round trip of one of the Apollo missions is sort of a week, 10 days, which is not a long time to be at home. But these days, of course, astronauts are spending time on the International Space Station. They're up there for 6 months or a year. And so that, even though you're not as isolated now, because of course we have the internet and we have communication, and we can do, but you can imagine a journey to Mars, for example, where suddenly the Earth isn't in your field of view anymore. Because in the International Space Station, you've got the cupola and you can look back at the Earth. So you have this emotional connection with the home. But you can imagine as you go further and further and further away, and the Earth recedes further and further and further away, and you're on a 9-month journey to Mars, then that's going to have serious kind of implications. And I think about those early, particularly the Soviet astronauts who spent time on those early space stations. It was really difficult, real hardship, dirty conditions, cramped conditions, tough conditions. So yes, the parallels between exploration on Earth and space are very similar. And also the language that we use. We talk about star sailors, the way that we navigate using the stars. The Apollo astronauts would use sextants to as well as computers to navigate. There is a great similarity between the language and the technology and the way we think about it.
You say in your book that that you've never met an astronaut that you don't like. Is that still true, or have you met one that you don't like?
Did I write that?
Yeah.
I can't remember what I wrote. It was so long ago.
I was thinking about, what are their qualities? Because you hear a lot about the overview effect that astronauts get when they see from a distance, and they'll cool in a crisis and this kind of thing. So what is it that you like about them so much?
Well, I don't know. Well, my dad was a pilot, for example, and there's that similarity. You have to obviously be the type of person that isn't going to flap. I could go into anyone here. We could go strap ourselves to a rocket and we could go up to space, and what, we'd be fine. We could survive and it would be okay and nothing bad. But it's what would happen in a crisis. What happens, for example, there's a great book that everyone should read. It's called Dragonfly, and it's about the crisis aboard the Mir space station. And actually, the British-American astronaut Michael Foale, if you listen to Michael Foale talking about the crash on the Mir space station, when one of the Russian Progress supply ships actually pierced the hull of the space station and all the air leaked out. And that moment of like, oh my God, we're in a space station and the air's going out and we've got minutes before we die. How do you behave? You know, and me, I'd be freaking out. I'd be crying. I'd be swearing. I'd be, you know, but these guys don't, you know, these astronauts, the men and women who, you know, who actually do that, they can put themselves in that position and work these problems and do it in a way that's calm and collected. But also the thing about the astronauts that I've met is they're just funny. They're funny. They've humility. They've got good humor. You know, they're just sort of good all-round human beings. It's not like I like them because they're great scientists or they're brave adventurers or they're very serious. They're funny. They get on well with each other. They get on well with people. And I think more than anything, that's probably the thing these days about the most important thing about being an astronaut. If you're cooped up with, you know, a bunch of people on a space station, you need to be able to get on well with people. And so, yeah, I guess that's why I said that.
Do you think that is something that might come from that overview effect? You know, that ability of seeing Earth from a distance and realizing that you shouldn't take life too seriously, perhaps, or the majesty of the universe from first-hand experience.
I certainly think, all the astronauts that I've spoken to, they've always said that has been a profound experience, that idea of seeing the Earth in context. It's a bit like stepping back from the canvas. Suddenly the painting makes sense. Down here on Earth, we don't really get a sense of the fact we're on this tiny little dot suspended in a sunbeam, but suddenly you take yourself away and you can see the Earth as a ball, particularly the Apollo astronauts who saw the Earth really as a ball. I mean, on the International Space Station, you're not actually that high. You know, you don't see the fullness of the Earth. I mean, yes, you see the curvature of the Earth and you see the blackness of space. But those Apollo astronauts, you know, who flew to the moon and could hold their thumb up and obscure the entire Earth from their thumb, that's a pretty amazing, a privileged position to have done. And only 24 humans in the history of all humans have seen that with their own eyes. Dear Al Warden, who was the command module pilot of Apollo 15, who became a good friend of mine in the last sort of few years, who I spoke to a lot when I was writing this book and is in the book. And we went to Alton Towers together, and he sadly died just a couple of weeks ago, and it was very, very sad. But to me, he was the sort of classic example of just why the sort of perfect astronaut. He was funny, he was irreverent, he had humility, he was bright, he was kind, he didn't have a bad word to say about anyone. He always had time for the kids. You know, he was just a really, really lovely guy. And I sort of see that thread of all the astronauts I've spoken to, really. They've all got a bit of a twinkle in their eye. And I think that's the thing. You kind of have to have a bit of a twinkle in your eye if you want to do something like be an astronaut or, you know, go and live in Antarctica for 6 months or...
Yeah, that does bring me to one of the most horrifying bits of your book, which is the brutal testing of astronauts before they go. Can you tell us about the Steel Eel?
I can't... Oh, yeah. There was... hold on one sec. Yeah, when I was researching, there was so from Johannes Kepler in 16, whenever it was, and I was kind of researching all the kind of original astronaut training stuff that was done. So the original Mercury astronauts. And everyone remembers the sort of famous scenes in the film of the Wright stuff. Do I have it? But there's some really terrifying descriptions of the medical procedures that those early astronauts had to go through in order to make sure they were flight ready. And one of them was called riding the Steel Eel, which was this great metal thing that was shoved up their arse. I'm trying to find the Oh, I forgot about this. There's a masturbation thing as well. Again, anyway, there's a whole... I mean, the medical stuff...
Well, underlined though, Dallas. You should remember that one.
Anyway, riding the Steel Eel was one, and there was some really kind of rather arcane and strange things that, like when they were testing the kind of radios that they were wearing, they had a special speech test to make sure that the astronauts could speak properly, and that the mission control would be able to hear them. So there's this wonderful a little passage that they had to read out, and it contains every vowel and every syllable there is. You wish to know all about my grandfather? Well, he's nearly 93 years old. This is what the astronauts had to say in order to make sure they could speak. Their diction was correct. He dresses himself in an ancient black frock, usually minus several buttons. Yet he still thinks as swiftly as ever. A long flowing beard clings to his chin, giving those who observe him a pronounced feeling of the utmost respect. When he speaks, his voice is just a bit cracked and quivers a trifle. Twice each day he plays skillfully and with zest upon our small organ, except in the winter, when the ooze or snow or ice prevents. He slowly takes a short walk in the open air each day. We have often urged him to walk more and smoke less, but he always answers, banana oil. Grandfather likes to be modern in his language. So that was an official NASA diction test that the astronauts had to take. And you know, this is the thing about being an astronaut. You have to be a genuine all-rounder. You've got to be able to speak properly. You've got to be able to do science. You've got to be an adventurer. You've got to be a television presenter. You've got to be a television producer. You've got to do all these things. And you've got to have steel bits of metal shoved up your jacksie. I'm trying to find the bit about the steel.
That expands like a parasol once they're inside.
Yeah,
That's quite horrifying aspect of it.
Anyway, this is the book this is the best book that describes it all, and I have a sort of a small edited version of this.
Oh yeah, so what about the psychological tests, like the station? I think, is it called Concordia, where you go to try out whether or not you can stand being with some annoying people in a enclosed space for a long time?
Yeah, well, Concordia base, that's in Antarctica, so when they're, you know, my friend Beth, for example, who works in space medicine, they do studies on human behavior and isolation to see how human beings behave in these enclosed and remote places. But certainly back then, you know, in the 1950s, no one really knew. There was no precedent. It's like, well, this new group of explorers we have called astronauts, what do we need to test them for? You know, they've got to stay alive, but no one had really thought about the psychological aspects. So they threw all these different psychological tests, things like you will have heard of, like a Rorschach test, looking at ink blots. You know, what do you see? They wanted to make sure that these people that they were going to send up there weren't going to suddenly start freaking out, or they weren't going to have a nervous breakdown, or they weren't going to kill each other. You know, it's not just being a good explorer and being Buck Rogers. You also need to be mentally stable, you know, and be able to understand risk and deal with danger in a way that isn't going to, you know, put anyone else at danger or yourself. So, you know, so there's...
Have you had any stories of astronauts like cracking under the pressure and going crazy?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there have been, particularly, you know, if you read, you know, the book Dragonfly, which talks a lot about the Mir space station. You know, you do get moments of conflict, and that can happen for all kinds of reasons. It could be conflict between the astronauts themselves, who suddenly might not get on, and particularly if you're dealing with astronauts who might be from different cultures or different backgrounds. But generally, you know, all the astronauts know each other, and they sort of do get on. But there's been stories of conflict between the astronauts and the ground because, you know, the work schedules have been too much. You know, examples of loneliness, examples of all kinds of things, the politics that go on between astronauts and the ground and the different countries. So yeah, I mean, conflict happens, but it's how you deal with it, and this is why astronauts are so well trained, and why the sort of communication now has got so much better than it ever used to be. So hopefully you don't really get the same kind of conflict as you do. And also what you want to do is you want to be able to predict in advance what kind of things may cause conflict. Actually, we mentioned food. Food is a really good example because obviously food needs to keep you alive, but it also has a huge psychological component. And in the early days, those kind of, let me show you, I've got some pictures here of, so this is, for example, let me just, the Apollo astronauts who went to the moon, like I said, they didn't have to go, they weren't really gone from Earth for very long. So this is the kind of food that you'd have to eat. And you can imagine going camping or something on a 2-week mission. You could live on food that looked a bit like that. Food that you would rehydrate with water, and you just like toothpaste food. And there's an example. That's a real Apollo era bacon sandwich or a bacon bar. But of course, if you're going to be up in the International Space Station for 6 months or a year, or if you're going to go on a round trip to Mars that's going to take 3 years, then food has a really, really important psychological component. And that's why this stuff, it's called bonus food. So all the astronauts would work with personal chefs to design the food that they particularly like, that makes them happy. And, Tim worked with Heston Blumenthal, and he wanted to make a bacon sandwich, and that became a thing. And, food makes you happy. You ask any explorer, food has a very important psychological component.
Does anyone else have any questions for Dallas?
I'm trying to find a bit about the steel eel.
Don't you have nightmares?
I spent so long going through this book, finding all the kind of crazy things.
Oh, go on.
Oh, no.
Anna, you've got a question?
I have got a question. Sorry, my question. Oh, I haven't got the screen on. My question is about Kepler and Kepler's mum, who was tried for witchcraft, wasn't she? And how you feel that might have affected what it disappeared, didn't it? This first text that he wrote about the journey, his imaginary journey into
Somnium.
space. Oh, is that actually? I thought it had disappeared.
Oh, maybe. I don't think so. I think you can still, I think bits of it, I think it's still
not the full text, because I've tried to write a play about it. So I don't think the whole thing exists. There's a great book, Kepler's Witch, about it, but I just wondered what you I was going to say, what were you, with your historical and anthropological knowledge of it, what you imagine he might have written in that I think science fiction text that no longer exists, and how it might have been influenced by his mum, because that description of who was going into space, like his mum.
Well, I think you're right. I think that we didn't really have science as we know it back then. So we didn't have scientists as we know it back then in the 1600s. So you had these kind of proto-scientists, Galileo and Kepler and Tycho Brahe, all these kind of people, were part of the culture of the day, which was things like alchemy and witchcraft and everything else. And so it all kind of gets jumbled up. And that's why something like, this particular book, the Francis Godwin one, which is 1638, is a really fantastic example of that, because within this wonderful kind of crazy story about a journey to the moon, just like Kepler was writing about as well, you start to see these seeds of modern science as we think about it. There's a really amazing description of gravity in here. And it was this was the first time within this book that the idea of gravity being different on the moon to the Earth was ever even postulated. And it wasn't done in a kind of scientific way, it was done in a kind of creative way. But all the kind of great, all the great rocket scientists, all the great scientists that I met, they're also dreamers, they're also artists and musicians. It's not like you're a scientist and it's like, I do science and that's it. These are creative people. And I think particularly people like Kepler, not that I'm a great expert on Kepler by any means, but I sense that searching, that creativity, wanting to understand more, and it getting tied in with the kind of fiction and exactly dream, somnium. It means dream. It's letting the imagination roam. So it doesn't surprise me that his mother was a witch. I didn't know that at all. But it's there must be somnium. It must be able to get it.
There was a theory that one of the inspirations for his journey into space was the fact that she used magic mushrooms, because she was tried for witchcraft,
right?
Which is what the book Kepler's Witch is about.
Yeah,
I thought That's why it sounded like her in the.
Well, I think doesn't Kepler mentions mushrooms in that little in that little bit I read. It's pretty trippy. I
He used to
think.
be really pissed off about garlic, which you'd think was quite,
Yes, garlic. It was garlic. It wasn't mushrooms. I'm trying to remember now. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, nothing to do with mushrooms. Just dried fish, garlic, and other abhorrent foods. But yeah, actually, it's quite interesting, that little bit about food just there. We choose those who regularly spend their time accustomed to living on hard bread. So even then, in the 1600s, Kepler was going, these need to be hardy people. They won't be having kind of bacon sandwiches made by Heston Blumenthal.
I guess the comparison at the time were people going on long sea voyages, and they were used to suffering and eating crappy food and getting scared and whatnot.
But I can certainly, the idea of taking hallucinogens, I can imagine taking magic mushrooms and going on these great flights of fancy. Space travel, since we've looked up in the sky, has always appealed to us. We've always wanted to imagine, we see these dots in the sky and we can imagine them as destinations, particularly the moon. There's been so many stories about, from history about people living on the moon and Mars as well, I suppose.
Oh yeah, we were talking about the moon exhibition that they had at the Maritime Museum, and you helped put that together. And we were talking about those imaginary maps.
Oh, you've frozen.
Oh, can you see me now?
Or I've frozen.
I think you've frozen. You're still talking though.
Anyone? Oh, am I still talking? Someone. Now I'm just got Ed again.
Sorry.
It's like being in a kind of weird development meeting time capsule bubble. Sorry, what was the question?
So that moon exhibition at the National Maritime Museum, we were talking about that a bit earlier because I went to that. I really loved that. And one of the things that I loved most about it were the early maps of the moon with these kind of imaginary colonies.
Oh, you've gone it.
And canals and rivers and...
Yeah, I can't hear you, unfortunately.
Oh, no, I can hear you all right.
Can you? Yeah, you freeze. Sorry, I got as far as the exhibition.
Yeah, tell us about that anyway.
Oh yeah, so the exhibition at the where was it? At the Maritime Museum.
Yeah.
My friend Melanie Vandenbroek was the curator of that exhibition, and it was an exploration of the moon, and about from sort of prehistory, our obsession with the moon through art and through culture and through space flight, and it coincided last year with the 50th anniversary of Apollo. But my favorite was this. It was I want to show you this. This was the very, very first thing when you went into that exhibition, which I wish I'd put in my book, but I totally forgot about it. Oh, where is it?
Up a bit.
Where? Oh, there it is. So this is the very first thing, and to me it sums up everything about why I'm interested in space flight is from this picture. So this is 1793, William Blake. This tiny little etching. It's really, really small, this picture, but this idea of this this child or young person climbing this ladder to the moon, and just the title, I want.
Lovely.
And I think that's what it's about. It's people say, well, why are you interested in space? I'm like, I'm not really interested in space. I'm kind of interested in math. I'm interested in why throughout all of time we've looked up and we've wanted to be there. We've wanted to go there. And so much of space history, like Kepler, like we were just talking about, art and culture and music and language and visual arts and music intertwines with actual exploration. And that's why I find it so interesting. When I've been to a couple of launches, a couple of rocket launches at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, and the thing that that's really interesting about those launches is that when you're standing next to the rocket, all the journalists are around you, and this Russian Orthodox priest with this great beard and these fantastic golden robes comes with this wonderful chalice and this great kind of and he does a communion, and all the people around, all the astronauts take communion, and the press there. And it's this wonderful tradition and ritual, which is a kind of hangover from a different age, and yet it means so much still. The fact that they have this religious service at this point where we leave the planet to ascend into the heavens, and the priest wears the robes and the astronaut wears the special robes. And there is something so symbolic about it, so beautiful. And that whole aspect of the history of spaceflight, to me, is the thing that's really interesting. The symbolism of it all. As an anthropological exercise, it is beautiful.
It does seem from the Russian activities in terms of going into space, they're a little bit more superstitious about doing the right things and lucky things before they go into space. Do you get similar things with the American astronaut?
Yeah, there's lots of superstitions. So oh, hello.
Yeah.
So that's Ed's tummy rumbling. That's Ed's digestion. Oh, what's going on?
Hang on, is that? I can't see if he's making the. I'll try the. Okay.
This is mute. I'm muted. Oh, I'm unmuted.
I unmuted you. I just unmuted everyone else if there's background noise for a bit.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so the Russians, when well, not just the Russians, because all astronauts at the moment still launch from Baikonur on the Soyuz rocket. Next month, of course, we're going to see the SpaceX Falcon 9 first two astronauts, I think, going to be going up on the Dragon capsule to the International Space Station. But still, since 2011, all the astronauts fly on Soyuz. So, Americans, European astronauts, and there's loads of superstitions. Very famously, Yuri Gagarin, on that very first launch at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, stopped in the bus on the way to the rocket, got out and took a pee on the back tire of the van. And still, every astronaut that flies on Soyuz does that. So on the way from the all suited up, on the way to the launch pad, the bus stops on the train track, they get out, they have a pee, and then they sort of get back. So that's the sort of very famous one. They sign a door, they plant a tree. There's a film that all the astronauts have to watch, White Suns of the Desert, I think it's called. They have to watch the night before launch. So there's all these kind of rituals and superstitions. These are all the things that Yuri Gagarin did. And because Yuri Gagarin is such the kind of the great hero, if it was good enough for Yuri Gagarin, it's good enough for everyone else. But the Americans as well, they had lots of, traditions and superstitions. I think all the Apollo astronauts had to eat steak and eggs before launch. And this is, again, it's part of being human. It's, we are superstitious animals. In times of risk, in times of uncertainty, we like to find patterns and we like to make order out of things. And that's kind of, I guess, where superstitions come from. Things we don't understand. We like rituals and we like doing things.
And a bit of OCD as well, maybe.
Well, maybe a little bit of OCD. I don't know. Yeah, maybe. But also, they're quite fun as well. I think us as viewers, we're quite enamored by the fact that astronauts, who we view as these superheroes, have these kind of rituals and traditions and bits and pieces that go on. It makes them human as well.
We had a talk on Friday night with Vicky Duncalf, who's like an astro blogger, astronomer, and Ray Stott, who is a satellite engineer and a kind of expert in all sorts of space industry and technologies. And we were talking about Starlink and Elon Musk, and we got onto the subject of Elon's Mars plans. Yeah. Which I remember when Mars One was first in the news and being really fascinated by the fact that anyone would want to volunteer to go and spend time on Mars. But what do you think about the plans to go and create a settlement on Mars and mine ice and all that business?
Again, it's been, as long as we've been thinking about going into space, which is forever, we've been thinking about going to Mars. Werner von Braun, of course, the German rocket scientist who we owe so much in terms of building the Saturn V rocket that took us to the moon, wasn't really thinking about the moon. He was thinking about Mars. And again, he was one of those dreamers, a little bit like Elon Musk is a dreamer, who, his whole reason for doing anything is to try and get humans to become a multi-planetary species. And, and so Mars has always been the logical next destination. There is something quite familiar about Mars. It's the nearest place where humans could live, a little bit like Antarctica again. It's, you know, we could go there. The Mars One thing I think was pretty crazy because the idea was, if you're not familiar with it, it was a one-way kind of mission. You would go to Mars and you would settle there, but you wouldn't come back.
Yeah, I had a fantasy about doing a film script where like a couple went and they were really in love and they fell out on the way there and then had to spend the rest of their life on having horrible arguments probably.
Yeah. The thing is about Mars One, it's like, and I can understand the thought behind it because it's like, oh well, when we went to America, when sort of Columbus went to America, and the first settlers went to America, you know, the thing is the difference between going to America and settling is that America's got things like air and food, and like, you know, and today like Earth has got like Nando's, Mars no Nando's. You know,
Could probably
like,
have Nando's. Give
maybe.
like 2030, I reckon there'll be a Nando's on Mars.
And so part of the problem with the Mars One thing, I think, was that all these people were applying, knowing that it was going to be a suicide mission. And of course, they're the last people you want to have on your flight crew, people who would like willingly go on a suicide mission. They're like the opposite of astronauts.
It's like going to
They're the wrong people.
Joe Exotic's farm.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, hey, don't get me started on that. I love that show. That's an amazing bit of television. Anyway, but yeah, I wasn't a big fan of it. I met the founder of Mars One, of that whole, and I kind of, you know, he was a nice guy, and I sort of understood the whole thing, but I think it was of its time. God, are we going to get to Mars in my lifetime? I don't think so, unfortunately.
Well, he reckons 2025.
Well, we're in 2020 now, and we haven't even been back to the moon yet.
I don't know. I've got a lot of confidence in Elon Musk pulling it off.
I have a lot of confidence in Elon Musk. He's one of those people, I guess, a bit like Dr. Werner von Braun, who divides opinion. A lot of people I know, particularly in the big sort of space institutions, the European Space Agency and NASA, don't have any time for him because they think he sort of trivializes it, and you know, they don't like the showboating, I suppose. But I see it as an extension of what we've had already. He's part of that sort of tradition of showboating when it comes to space. I mean, there is a bit of PR when it comes to space. Werner von Braun, for example, and Walt Disney worked together. You know, they sold the idea of space to the American public. Von Braun, Willy Ley, Walt Disney, you know, they sold the idea of the astronaut and made space popular. And I think Elon Musk has done the same thing, as well as building rockets. And of course,
Elon does have that kind of old school pioneer feeling about him as well, where he's prepared to do things that have never been done before. And all the greatest inventions really come from those kind of people.
Yeah, you know, and he gets stuff done. You know, he doesn't just talk. He doesn't just talk about it. He actually gets stuff done. You know, Americans are going to be flying next month from America to the International Space Station. You know, and that wasn't going to happen without Elon Musk. You know, and he's, you know, and some of the stuff's not. You know, the trip around the moon with the Japanese artist and all this. I don't know when any of that's going to happen or not. You know, we find ourselves in this very difficult situation at the moment with this pandemic, and I don't know how that's going to affect everything. But you know, Mars is orders of magnitude harder than going to the moon. You know, the moon isn't very far away; it's just a few days away. The moon is always the same distance from the Earth. Okay, Mars, sometimes it's over there and sometimes it's here. You know, so it's not just an easy round trip. If we go to Mars, we have to go there to stay. You know, we have to be thinking about building settlements. We have to be thinking about fuel, propulsion, all this kind of stuff. It's
Starbucks, Ian suggested.
And what?
Starbucks,
very well, maybe not Starbucks. But yeah, it's hard. And do we care enough at the moment? I mean, here we are, when we think about Apollo in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of resistance to Apollo. You know, America was fighting Vietnam at the time. You know, so America had a war in Vietnam, and they were spending money, all this billions and billions going to the moon. There were civil rights issues, all kinds of problems at the time. And we see the same thing now. I mean, is the public willing to accept governments and spending billions and billions on a Mars project when there's all these kinds of issues going on Earth? I don't know.
I guess that's the beauty of an internet billionaire spending billions and billions on going to Mars, maybe.
Yeah, maybe, but I don't know. I think the world is going to look very different next year. I think priorities are going to change a lot, and I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, let's see what happens when the Artemis project happens, which is us, the space agencies returning to the moon. Donald Trump said we're going to be doing this by 2020 crumbs. When was it? 2024 or was it 2028? I can't even remember now. But
is that Space Force?
No, that's not Space Force. So Space Force is a ridiculous thing. This is a new American military department concerned with space. Artemis is actually returning to the moon and actually setting up a kind of almost like an international space station, but in lunar orbit, called Lunar Gateway, a small space station when astronauts can actually go back down to the surface and what have you. So that's the plan. So long before we go to Mars, we'll be going back to the moon.
So we've talked a bit about us going off planet.
Yeah.
I know that you're very interested in conspiracy theories and ancient aliens and things of that ilk. So what about aliens? What do you think about life?
Well, I'm interested in them because I'm interested in why people believe weird things. I find, but actually it's partly my age. I grew up with things like Arthur C. Clarke's World of the Unknown. I grew up in the 1970s where things like flying saucers and Loch Ness monsters were, those are all the things we had to worry about. Things like, oh my God, spontaneous human combustion. That's the thing I'm going to have to really worry about as an adult. But of course, these things aren't actually true. And yet I'm interested in why we preserve them in our mind, why we find them so fascinating. And last year was really interesting. I spent a lot of time last year during the Apollo 50th going around schools giving talks about Apollo. And of course, these conspiracy theories we didn't land on the moon have just become mainstream because the internet, it's not like we've had more conspiracy theories, but the internet has supercharged them. So suddenly all these ideas are just out there and people pick up on them, and we're seeing all these crazy conspiracy theories now about 5G and COVID and what have you. But these are old. We've always had conspiracy theories. We tend to think of them as rather new. But
Ed's fallen asleep.
Ed's fallen asleep.
No, I'm still awake. Why am I this? I seem to be the kind of the second. Why is everyone looking at me?
It keeps cutting to you. Maybe it just keeps cutting to you. You keep changing your chair as well.
Yeah, no, I had to go because Claire, my wife, suddenly started watching Killing Eve. I think that was a disturbance, and it was a bit kind of weird. There were you talking away, and there was someone getting their throat slit behind you, and it didn't work.
Have you watched Tiger King?
I'm kind of resisting it.
It's so
maybe
good.
because I know, but it's like, well, you know me. I just if somebody says something's good, I have to not do it.
Okay.
Just to say I haven't. I mean,
exactly the same.
Big confession of the night. I've never seen Star Wars.
Good. Star Wars is not a good film.
I know it's not good, but you know what I mean. I just don't do.
I'm going to get lynched now. I'd say it's an okay film. It was a good film when I watched it in 1978. I watched Close Encounters the other night, talking about
the first Zoom lynching, if that were the case.
Yeah, I like Star Wars. It's okay. Close Encounters is a better film than Star Wars, in my opinion. What was I talking about?
Aliens. And
aliens. Yeah, what do I think about aliens?
Do you not think that aliens are a possibility?
Yeah, well, look, here we go. We've been thinking about aliens since Kepler, and they were all writing about aliens. And of course, our imaginations, we can imagine these other worlds, these other planets. We can see these other planets. And it's a natural extension of our imagination to assume there is life beyond there. We understand there is life on Earth. In fact, Ed, who we've been talking about a lot, and myself, we made a documentary all about aliens, about the Drake equation. And I've been interested again in the sort of parallels between how science has been thinking about looking for life and how our imaginations have imagined what life would be. My own particular view is I think, space is big, very big, and there's lots of real estate out there. So I think there's almost certainly is life out there. Whether it's complex life, who knows? But I certainly don't think we've been visited by aliens. And I certainly don't think the government have been covertly hiding.
What, even though you met Bob Lazar in Area 51?
Yeah, even though I've been out to Area 51 and I've done all that, and I've got a million books on UFOs. UFOs are a wonderful part of folklore, a wonderful part of our stories that we tell ourselves, and I like them for that. And the history of the UFO is a fascinating history. It's a really, really interesting subject to dive in, but it doesn't mean they're actually real. These are a modern equivalent of folk stories that our ancestors would have told each other about angels and things they see flying in the sky. The sort of the flying saucer is the modern equivalent that actually sort of comes from our fears. Flying saucers, it's no coincidence that the modern flying saucer was born in 1947 after the war. It was the Cold War. It was the fear of the Russians. It was the fear of nuclear power and nuclear explosions. These flying saucers were seen over Air Force bases. It comes from our paranoia, our fears, our hopes, our dreams. We've frozen again.
Oh, have we?
Oh no, you're back.
It was just more silence, I think.
Oh, was that orcs?
Has anyone else got any other questions? I feel like
I'm bored of talking. Someone asked me a question.
Yeah, ask me a question. Oh, Rosanna's got another one.
Oh, okay.
Are you typing it, or are you going to ask?
No, I did already ask a question, so I feel a bit greedy. But it's just reminding me about in Goon Hilly by the space, the satellite station. Yeah. There's this menhir, this megalith thing, and you probably know it, but the way they're juxtaposed next to each other, and I mean, most people think it's just a kind of landmark, but there are some people who think, it was there was some sort of hope of contacting the heavens there. I just wondered if you'd got any other examples of sort of ancient cultures that you thought might have been trying to kind of do kind of heavenly communicate. I mean, I suppose all the pyramids are like that.
Well, isn't kind of all religion basically that? Trying to communicate to the heavens in some form or other. I mean, most sort of rituals that involve supernaturalism of some kind is trying to communicate to agency beyond what we experience here on Earth. I don't know about the Goon Hilly. I mean, certainly we see all these kind of rituals throughout. All cultures have, the idea of, well, I suppose it's not just sort of, I suppose it's aliens. I mean, obviously things like ghosts and within religion, but I don't really know about sort of aliens particularly. I once tried to get abducted by aliens when I was in America a few years ago.
How did you go about that?
Well, I was a bit annoyed because my point was, how come only sort of people who believe in UFOs get abducted by aliens? It's a bit like, how come only people who believe in ghosts get to see ghosts? Like, why can't I, as someone who doesn't believe in ghosts, why can't I see a ghost? Like, why is it ghosts hide themselves from me and not from believers?
Maybe you're not spiritual enough.
Well, I don't exactly. It's always like a really rubbish excuse like that. It's like, well, what does that mean to be not spirit? What? Like, why when you die do you suddenly become an idiot and like, oh, I'm only going to appear to people who believe in ghosts? Like, if I was going to die and I could come back, I wouldn't do all the kind of mystical flapping books, bleeding walls thing. I'd just like sit down and have a normal chat like this. Like, why? Anyway, so alien abduction. I thought what I'd do is I'd find someone who's being abducted by aliens and handcuff myself to them and see if we could be abducted, but nothing happened.
How long were you handcuffed to them for?
Well, we didn't, not for very long, because we were going to shoot a whole episode about it, but our series got cancelled before we even shot that.
Did you do one episode of being handcuffed at least?
Somewhere I've got some photos of that particular shoot. But I've always been interested in that idea of the idea of alien abduction, of being sort of transported up, has interesting symbolism there.
Well, there's been a lot of UFO sightings reported over the last couple of weeks because of Starlink. So it goes to show that the UFO belief is still going strong.
Well, it sort of comes in ebbs and flows and comes and peaks. And actually, sort of technology is quite interesting. In the old days, a bit like ghosts. Ghosts hide in the dark when you can't quite see them. As soon as you turn the lights on, the ghosts vanish. And UFOs are a bit like that as well. You only see them at the corner of your eye. And in the 1980s, when we had cameras with film, they were just kind of blurs. They would be grainy. You wouldn't be able to see them quite properly. But of course, nowadays we all walk around with high definition video cameras. We don't see flying saucers anymore, and that's because the technology has killed them off.
Do you think that our kind of imagination does run parallel with technological advancements though? Because I was reading earlier about how when glass was invented, this psychological condition of believing you were made from glass became a phenomenon, which I think is amazing. And so we must fit our
we do.
phenomena to cultural advancement.
Well, if you think about the Victorians, for example, so the advent of things like cameras, the advent of recorded sound, suddenly we were getting all kinds of a new type of spiritualism coming, people sort of photographing ghosts for the first time, the Cotting's Fairy, very famous photograph, recording ghosts, the sound, and all this kind of stuff. And as the technology changes, then our belief in supernaturalism changes as well. And of course, it's all moved on to the internet now. There's kind of creepypasta, weird videos and haunted videos and haunted websites and all this kind of thing. But actually, the sort of flying saucers, they've sort of died a death. Flying saucers were big in the 1980s and the sort of early 90s. But then as the technology got better and better, and actually revealed that there was nothing there, then where do you go? I mean, occasionally there are still, flying saucer stories. The Nimitz flying saucer story that's got everyone, that kind of radar with the kind of flying saucer, the gun camera image that everyone's been talking about. People get very cross when I tell them I don't believe it. So it is still there. It's not going away, but yeah, technology definitely changes things. And we have a fear of technology as well. There was a Swiss scientist, Konrad Gessner, whose name was, who wrote a really interesting paper about how the kind of always on culture of information, the constant flow of information is really bad for the human mind. And the interesting thing about Gessner was he was writing in the 1600s, and he was still talking about the advent of the printing press and how that was going to be detrimental to the human memory. So fear of technology and conspiracy and all this is as old as humans.
What's your favorite conspiracy theory?
What's my well, depends what you mean by favorite. There's some which I just think are preposterous. I mean, I've always had a soft spot for flying saucers, and I love the kind of culture of flying saucers from that folklore perspective. I think it's really interesting, and so that, I guess that's my favorite. But there's some real bonkers ones. Like, have you come across the chemtrails one? People who believe that aircraft contrails are actually a covert, secret weather geoengineering, weather manipulation thing. And the fact that people actually believe that, sensible people, to me is baffling. I mean, I suppose flat Earth stuff is pretty baffling. The whole COVID 5G stuff is pretty baffling. I mean, 5G, that conspiracy has been going as long as I've heard of 5G. So sort of 5 years, I've known people have been worrying about 5G in the same way that they worried about electricity pylons and mobile phones, and any new technology comes with this kind of fear. But the fact that it's morphed into the current pandemic fears as well, and they've kind of joined up these conspiracy theories, is I find quite interesting. But of course, conspiracy theories they're not isolated. If you believe chemtrails, you probably also believe that 5G is going to be detrimental to your health. And you believe the Earth is flat, you probably believe in, geoengineering conspiracies as well. So,
well, I suppose there's still that divide between normal everyday people who just go about their lives and the scientists or people that are operating these technological systems and they have an understanding of the way that they work. But there's an element of magic still in science where the everyday person doesn't necessarily understand how these modern technologies work.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I was thinking about this today, actually. There's a big disconnect. And I think there is a fundamental misconception from some people about what science is. I think people very often look at science and see it as a kind of doctrine, as a kind of book of facts, like an authority. And of course, science isn't that. Science is all about embracing doubt and being comfortable with uncertainty. And I think if more people kind of realize that, then maybe some of these, I don't think conspiracies would go away, but I think there does seem to be an us and themness about people who buy into these conspiracy theories. They talk about mainstream science. It's always us versus them. It's good versus evil. Very simple dichotomies, which you can understand why people buy into them, but they're not true. They're not, it's not an accurate picture of the world.
So are you writing a book about conspiracy theories?
Yeah, I'm working on a book at the moment about sort of conspiracies, about almost a little bit like my space book, really, from a sort of cultural point of view, an illustrated guide to conspiracy theories. Why is it that people believe weird things? Why, where do these things come from? What is the history of them? Some of the more odd, some of the more esoteric ones, and a bit of the psychology as well about why is it that people have a tendency to see conspiracy where there isn't conspiracy, to detect agency where there isn't agency. I think it's a really interesting subject.
Would you say like the kind of old idea of people living on Mars could have been a sort of conspiracy theory, with the...
Yeah, definitely. Well, the Mars, the famous Percival Lowell canals on Mars, again, it's a bit like the fuzziness of data. It's a bit like when I was talking about ghosts with the light off. Percival Lowell looked through a telescope, and the telescope wasn't very good, and he looked at Mars and it was a bit blurry, and he saw these lines on Mars, these kind of strange striations. Who was the Italian astronomer before? Someone help me. The Italian astronomer who came up with canali.
Was it Schiaparelli?
Schiaparelli, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, exactly. He'd heard of Schiaparelli and that idea of canali, but when Schiaparelli was talking about canali on Mars, that's these same strange lines, he didn't mean canals, he just meant kind of ditches. But when Percival Lowell looked through his telescope, he interpreted the idea of canal and then interpreted the idea of these must be some kind of geoengineering project in order to take the water from the poles to the equatorial regions of Mars. So it was a big engineering project. And, that idea stuck. And of course, it wasn't that at all. It was just that his own confirmation bias had kicked in. When we have strong beliefs about anything, we are liable to fool ourselves. And this is a fundamental part of human nature. And this is why conspiracy theories exist. We see what we want to see all the time. And the canals on Mars are exactly the same thing. And the idea of the Martian, of course, the famous Orson Welles radio broadcast of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, funnily enough, didn't happen. They always say, there was this great panic when everyone thought it was a real, a real event. But that itself is a conspiracy theory. There was no panic. Everyone knew that Orson Welles' radio play was a radio play. That's a famous bit of fake news.
Do you think that there's an aspect where maybe people living in times where things like space and other continents weren't well known, that they had a different state of consciousness? Because we were talking earlier about sailors, and sailors could embark upon a journey and think they might fall off the end of the earth or discover sea monsters. They'd land on the shores of the country and they'd have no points of reference for the kinds of life and the animals that they saw there. Do you think we're missing out a little bit now, where we kind of think we know everything?
I don't think we know. The genius of science is that we don't know everything, and that's the whole point of science. People think that, you scientists, you know everything. No, it's the exact opposite. Science is just turning over stones to see what's underneath, and we're not running out of stones. That's why, for me, science is so interesting and so beautiful and so brilliant, because it is all about doubt. The more we understand about nature, the deeper we go, the more uncertainty we have. We just have uncertainty. We have more uncertainty, but at a deeper level, if you know what I mean. And I think that's why space, the sort of symbolism of spaceflight kind of reflects that. I think the idea of going to other planets, what we might find, who we might find, what life might look like, how we might find that life. Yeah.
But you don't fancy going to any other planets?
Well, not really. If I had to, I'd like to go to the moon. I think I'd like to go to the moon because I'd like to, I think, historically, the moon's always felt familiar, growing up with Apollo and growing up with, that as part of my life, and having met people who've been to the moon and studied the moon. So for me personally, that holds a great interest. And also I'd like to stand on the moon and look at the Earth. A few years ago, actually, when I was doing the book, I went to the European Astronaut Centre to interview some astronauts, and they've got a virtual reality program where they train the astronauts to show what it's like to be on the moon. And I put it on, and it was amazing. I was there standing on the moon and looking at the Earth and through this amazing virtual reality, and it felt really quite special.
Were you like, that's enough, don't need to go to the moon
now?
Well,
no, I'd like to go, and I'd like to go as well, because I know it's only like a few days, a week to get there and a week to get back, or however long it takes, a few days, depending on how fast you go. It's not going to take, I'm done and dusted, in a couple of weeks. And I think that seems about the right amount of time. The idea of going to Mars, because I know that's 3 years that's going to take. I think I might freak out.
Well, it wasn't Mars just going to be a one-way trip?
Well, Mars?
Yeah.
I don't think it will be a one-way trip. I don't think we'll go to Mars on a one-way trip. I think that idea is, it sort of popped up a few years ago with this Mars One thing, but I don't think there's a public appetite to send people on a suicide mission to Mars. And also, what's the point? What would be the point of that? I don't think that's kind of what we want people to come back again.
I don't know whether Elon Musk actually wants to go into space, does he, or to another planet? I can't imagine he wants to go to Mars.
I don't know. I don't know if he wants to go to Mars. I think he wants us to go to Mars. He goes on about it quite a lot. He's quite keen on that.
I think if he gets too many of his Starlink satellites up there, you won't be able to get out anyway.
Yeah, space debris. It's a big, it's an increasingly big problem as that low Earth orbit becomes increasingly busy with stuff. It's going to become more and more tricky.
I didn't realise Richard Branson's got his constellation going up as well.
Really?
Yeah, he's got one called OneWeb.
Man, everyone's got their own little mini sats. I need my own. I need my own constellation. I haven't seen it yet. Have you looked up and seen it?
I've looked and I haven't seen it yet.
Okay.
Lots of people have said they've seen it in Hastings and St Leonard's.
And what's the kind of feel when you did your SpaceX talk with Vicky the other day? What was the feeling? Did people think it was a good thing or a bad thing?
I think that a lot of astronomers have been complaining about it to Vicky. She's got a lot of astronomer friends.
Is it spoiling the night sky?
Yeah, it is. But then Elon Musk is now saying that he's going to put this dark foam on the satellites to reduce the glare. So he's working with astronomers to sort that problem out. And then they're in this low parking orbit at the moment, but they're going to go higher. And so for people observing the night sky with the naked eye, it's not going to have too much of an effect. But for optical telescopes, it could still cause issues. And it is a massive increase on the amount of space junk up there, because I think Ray was saying there's something like maybe the 2.5, I can't remember how many it was. Not really an enormous amount of working satellites in space now.
Yeah.
And some people think SpaceX are going to send up 42,000 satellites.
Okay.
Which is massive. Well, they say some people are saying 12,000, and then some people are saying that's not going to be enough, so it's going to be more like 40.
Blimey. Wow. All right. Well, yeah, it's a lot of stuff, and of course it's all whizzing around very, very quickly, and
beaming us all with 5G.
Exactly, with their mind rays. Man, that 5G stuff, Jesus. I mean, that's some fringe. Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
I mean, it's an incredible, not coincidence, but weird development that we're all in lockdown while everyone starts to notice these satellites. So you can see how people are starting to get paranoid that it's all part of a plot.
Well, here's the thing. People just want to try and understand the world. People want to make sense of things. And they see patterns, they see things, they have their confirmation biases, they see all this. And that's how these conspiracy theories start. And every bit of technology that comes along, radio, television, everything has its, oh, television is going to rot the mind, and video games are going to be the ruination of us all.
True though, isn't it?
That's true. So this is, I think this is pretty normal stuff. But it makes for some entertainment as well. It makes for some...
I enjoy conspiracy theories, I must say.
Yeah, I went to the Flat Earth convention in Birmingham a couple of years ago. It was pretty interesting. Just I wanted to try and understand and find out what was going on. You know, and I've spoken to people who, you know, this isn't like, these are not crazy people, but you know, they're intelligent people, and it's you can understand why these beliefs start to sort of permeate through the culture. But certainly the Apollo 50th, we didn't land on the moon. You know, that comes from a very, very specific time. There was a book or a pamphlet that was written called "We Did Not Land on the Moon, America's $1 Billion Secret," I think it was called. It was published in 1975, so just after Apollo. I forget the name of the guy who it was, in fact, that pamphlet was in the exhibition at the Royal Maritime Museum as part of the sort of history. But of course, it kind of died a death, that particular conspiracy theory. No one really thought about it. It came about because of Watergate and because of, you know, the sort of change in politics in America in the mid-1970s. You know, there was distrust in politicians, and there was the end of Vietnam, and all this kind of stuff was going on. But it was kind of picked up again because of the internet, this new technology. Suddenly that was found again, that ideas, and then it was picked up by this person and that person. Suddenly the internet has made it mainstream. People with their social media and their little kind of will follow the people who believe this kind of stuff. And I walk into schools and there's 16-year-old, you know, kids telling me that we didn't land on the moon because the flag was waving, or these kind of ridiculous ideas.
I think it's a creative expression in some ways. And I wonder whether with the internet and with people spending so much time online, rather than sitting around pottering, doing watercolor paintings and stuff, they're creatively using their imagination to create stories from things that they see on the internet.
Well, I don't know if it's a sort of creative thing. I think people are have natural suspicions based on something they've read, and then they see something else, and then they collect that, and then they find something else and find someone that agrees with them. People like to find things that agree with what they think. You know, so when people say, "Oh, I've done the research, I've seen all the research about vaccinations," they haven't done the research. They've just found something that chimes with what they think already, and you know, and so that's kind of what happens. But I don't know. But I mean, I don't know about the sort of creative element for it, and it certainly comes from a desire to want to understand the world, want things to make sense, want order and chaos. So I think conspiracy theories are perfectly natural and very human things to happen. We're all conspiracy theorists. I mean, also we have to stop talking about conspiracy theorists like us and them. We all have weird beliefs.
Yeah,
we all have strange things that we think, and you know, there is no objective reality to anything. There is just this kind of spectrum of belief.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Because
ask me about conspiracy. I love conspiracy theories.
Yeah, ask him about some conspiracy theories.
Sure.
My favourite one about the 5G and the COVID was that they were blaming the COVID on 5G, where there wasn't any 5G.
Yeah, well, the thing is, if you know, all these conspiracies, they don't actually make sense when you start to pick them apart, and when you start to, you know, when you look at them too closely. I mean, the 5G thing started and the COVID started because there was some said, oh, 5G was first rolled out in Wuhan, and you know, and so that connection was made. And it's about kind of, people like to join dots. People will see these abstract ideas and join the dots and make pictures. But the trouble is with joining the dots and making pictures, it's fine if the join the dots have got numbers on and you go from 1 to 2 and you draw a picture of a giraffe because that's what it's meant to be. But if it's just free association of dots, like stars in the sky, you draw dots and you make a crab or a hunter or a plow or whatever it is. You just make up whatever is on your mind at the time. So our ancestors drew these pictures in the sky using the stars that we still have now. And You know, if we were drawing constellations now without that history, we'd be drawing all kinds of things. We'd be drawing like 5G towers. In our imaginations.
What about the scientific search for extraterrestrial intelligence, like SETI?
Yeah.
They're obviously more scientific approach to looking for signs from the...
Yeah, the scientific approach is stop believing stuff. Stop believing in flying saucers and little green men and whatever, and actually do some proper research, which is based on evidence and uncertainty. And the history of the search for extraterrestrial life really revolves around SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And so we have people like Carl Sagan and Frank Drake to thank for that. Ed, who we've met, we did a program about the Drake equation, which is not really an equation at all, but it's a framework, a way of asking the question. If we wanted to find out is there life beyond the Earth, how would we go about doing it? Like, what do we need to know? And so Frank Drake and Carl Sagan and these other people, they came up with these series of parameters. So, you know, n equals, I can't remember the equation now, it's been so long since I looked at it, but, you know, the numbers of stars that form in a particular galaxy, the number of those stars that would have planets, you know, around them, the number of those planets that would be in habitable zones, the number of those that, you know, so you have all these things that you can multiply together. And we know certain amounts, bits of science about all of these factors. And as our science gets better, we know sort of more and more and more. We start to sort of fill in the gaps. And so it's you know, it's not a great equation. It doesn't give you an answer. It's a series of estimates. It's a series of unknowns, kind of I don't know, not unknowns, but things that, you know, we're not entirely certain about, but we're getting better at. So it's, and from a historical point of view, it's quite a good starting point of thinking about that question. But yes, science we will understand about life beyond the Earth through science, not through pseudoscience. We will understand by the James Webb Telescope looking at the, you know, the atmosphere of an exoplanet and looking at the chemistry of that and seeing that it's got oxygen or it's got methane or whatever it is, and we'll be able to make conclusions based on that, not through a kind of flying saucer. Sadly, as much as I'd like to.
You do get abducted by an alien, and then you'll change your tune.
I might bring it on, and also remember the Steel Eel.
Yeah, the Steel Eel.
Aliens love a bit of probing. We know that.
Well, we're not too
different. A bit of rectal probing.
Are we?
The what?
We're not too different from aliens then.
No. Ride the Steel Eel.
Speak for yourself.
Ed loves a bit of probing.
It looks like you've got the camera on the end of your probe there.
I want to find that Steel Eel reference. Maybe I dreamt it. Maybe it doesn't exist.
Oh, I definitely read about the Steel Eel. It's going to haunt my dreams.
Yeah.
But while you're looking for it, I was going to say that the SETI at Home project is that is winding down or has wound down already.
That's right.
Because they've got so much data back from the people who were running the application on their computers at home that they've now got about 10 years worth of results of that to go through, and they don't want any more.
Well, Ed and I, we filmed with Frank Drake, it's his 90th birthday actually this week, Frank Drake. And
oh, wow.
We went to Green Bank Telescope in West Virginia, and we did the original SETI search, the Epsilon Eridani Tau SETI search that Frank Drake did, and we kind of recreated it. So I feel privileged to have done that, being part of that history. Oh, guess what, everyone? I found the bit. I've even put exclamation marks. You ready? This is it.
This might be a nice little phrase to end our interview.
I think so. So they're talking. So this is the astronaut. They're all talking about doing all these crazy, and you know, you've seen famously from the right stuff. One common recollection is the force with which the prostate examination was carried out. Some of the men even bled from the anus after an unnecessarily rigorous probing. One candidate reflected on what they called riding the Steel Eel. It involved a metallic probe being inserted up their anus and then spread open inside the rectum to allow physicians to peer into their bowel. And that is why I like talking about space.
Well, that was wonderful. What a nice note to end our chat
On that bombshell.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and
It's been a bit waffly, sorry, but
thank you for waffling, Dallas. It was great, high quality waffle. Really appreciate you joining us on.
That's okay. I had nothing else in my diary.
It was great.
I'm
So
glad
I
I
look
didn't
forward
buy
to
a
your-
diary.
I look forward to your in-person talk at the Marina Fountain in September as well.
I'll do a little bit more of a focus talk on the history of the spacesuit.
Yeah.
Nice
Fantastic.
to see everyone, though. Nice to see, and Ed, lovely to see you.
Yes, hopefully we'll see you properly, as it were, soon.
Yeah, when let's meet up some point.
Okay,
Agreed.
Thanks for an interesting evening.
you're very welcome.
Cheers. Stay well, everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye all.